Hello everyone, my name is Cream Pecoraro, and today we are going to be exploring the world of medieval midwives, expanding on what we had already learned during week 4. These women played an incredibly important role in society. They helped to deliver babies, they cared for new mothers, and they often provided essential healthcare services to their communities, but this also made them incredibly vulnerable to being blamed for medical complications and even accused of witchcraft. Let's delve into who they were, what they did, and some of the stories and details that bring their lives into clearer focus. Who were midwives? Midwives were women who had knowledge of healing, childbirth, and minor medical procedures and used this knowledge to serve the community, normally in exchange for money or goods. What were their responsibilities? Their responsibilities mainly were to expectant mothers and postnatal care. They would also be responsible for caring for minor injuries, providing herbal salves and different basic medications to help with ailments, and they also were relied on for emergency spiritual services. The daily life of a midwife, they were still responsible for all of the work that a typical woman would be doing in medieval times. This included cleaning, childcare, if there's any farm work, if her husband has some kind of job, she probably would be working with that. She would always, on top of this, be on call for childbirth and basic medical services. They would come right to her house, get her, or summon her, and that's what you do. It didn't matter what time it was. She also would be responsible for some religious and spiritual oversight in the community, but this varied very differently depending on what point of medieval times we were looking at. One famous story that I find really highlights this is a letter that has remained from an unknown midwife to a worried expectant mother who is concerned that this particular midwife will not be able to attend her birth because this midwife has some mobility complications of her own. This midwife wrote that, "I will attend your labor, and I swear upon my duty to God and to you that even if I cannot walk, even if I must be wheeled to your bedside, I shall be there." I feel like this very much highlights just how dedicated these women were to their work and to their community and their patients, much like you see with many nurses today. Why did a medieval woman choose to become a midwife? Mainly, it's because there were few available independent professions available to women. They kind of could pick one of a couple things, and this was one of them. It was also a family trade for many people. If your mother was a midwife, it's very likely you would be a midwife. Maybe your aunt was. It's something that was passed down from mother to daughter. This was also a great way for women to serve their community. It was also incredibly a necessity because men were not allowed in the birthing room. They weren't often allowed to take care of female patients. There was a lot of it wasn't a thing unless maybe we're talking about incredibly important royal births where there's a lot of political factors involved. How did a midwife learn the trade? Well, we kind of talked about it a little bit. They were not formally educated. There wasn't a college or a university that they went to learn these skills. They tended to learn them just because they were with their mothers or other family members, and often this means they were there and helping hands-on during this training. So if a midwife is having a patient in her room having a baby, their daughter's going to be right there helping. They're going to be getting buckets, getting things that they need, changing water, and that is mostly how they're going to be learning this craft. Though there were some situations where a young girl, maybe their family decides this is a good opportunity for her, they could do an apprenticeship, just like how you would do an apprenticeship for a blacksmith or a candle maker. You would live with your midwife teacher and eventually take up that practice or start your own practice with the knowledge that you have gotten. Some of the procedures, the tools, and the treatments. So one of the things that I find incredibly fascinating about midwifery is that the tools and techniques that they used during this medieval period were incredibly basic, but incredibly effective. They often used the birthing stool, which is depicted over here. We learned a little bit about this, and essentially just brings the woman into a position that is a little bit more comfortable and creates a easier birth most of the time. So the procedures that they mostly would do: childbirth, breached births, which the tool, unfortunately for that, would tend to be the hands, which, as we learned in a time before rudimentary hand washing and germ knowledge, did not always end up well for the mother. They would, as depicted here and we talked about, there might be a C-section. This was almost always post-mortem and almost always an emergency. The mother, I didn't find any situation where she survived, unfortunately, which is kind of expected at this time in life. So the post and prenatal care, that is something that the midwife would be attending to after the baby was born. She would still be coming and making sure everything's okay, making sure the mother is healing okay. And as we talked about, there were spiritual services. These would be emergency baptisms, so a baby that we did not think was going to survive long enough to get a baptism from a male priest. An emergency last rite, so like a woman who we feel like is not going to make it through this procedure and she needs to do her last rites emergency-wise. And there may also be a situation where there's a stillborn baby, and if this is the case, the midwife will also be responsible for taking care of the last rites and the situations for the stillborn baby. Where did midwives practice their trade? So, almost all midwives, we had mentioned they were always on call to assist the community with medicine and healing, but the births almost always happened at home for both the high and the low classes. We'll go over a little bit about what the differences are on the next page, but here are some immediate differences. You can see much different way that this is depicted. A royal birth versus a peasant birth had some very fundamental differences. First, the preparation of the space was very different. For a wealthier family, there is going to be additional support. There's going to be servants, family members. They're going to help prepare the room with different linens, herbs, religious icons. There may even be a special room that is a birthing chamber specifically for this. This is the one opportunity where there may actually be a man in the room because it's that important, whereas a commoner birth is going to essentially have the midwife, maybe the people who are in the room with them, that they have their own children to help, but it's not going to be as much of a fancy, nice situation. You're going to be in a lot less of a cleanly place. There's going to be a lot less infection control. But who is present? Again, so a royal birth is going to have midwives. There's going to be servants, family members. There may actually be some men in the room just to make sure because it's that important. They're going to be more spacious with better conditions. The role of the midwife will still remain the central key of what her work is. She's going to be attending to the birthing process. But in a peasant family, this is going to be happening with a much more modest situation, and there's not going to be the same amount of people. What it meant two very different things. So if it is a royal birth is going to be incredibly important due to rites of succession. If it's part of why we have such detailed records about midwives specifically in this area. A common birth is still a very important situation because it's going to mean that that family has more resources, but it also means that now they have to feed another mouth. Noble royal families, the birth of a child, specifically if it is a male, it's going to be highly significant and could also influence future political and social dynamics. But in a poorer family, the birth is still going to mean just adding another member to the house, which can help or not help. But it's still going to be a very exciting and good time for the community and the family. The rewards and dangers of being a midwife. So as a midwife, you are going to get a reliable income, which as a woman is going to be awesome. Most women, as we've learned through this class, finding a reliable income really depended most on who you married and where you were. You're going to get respect. Although there is a bit of some preconceived notions, as we'll talk about very shortly, midwives were incredibly respected. They were very large pillars of the community, and they really were very looked up upon. And one of the biggest rewards is they got to serve their community. However, there were some dangers, As a midwife taking care of ill people, you are going to be more open to disease. If someone's sick, you're going to be right there and you could become sick because of that. If there is a bad outcome, such as a birth that does not result in a living child, specifically if we go back to those male heirs and those royal births, that could be something that the midwife is put at fault for and she takes the blame for that, which is very bad if you are perceived to have murdered a royal prince. This also could lead them open to accusations, specifically later in the medieval times. Later on, there were many trials where midwives were accused of witchcraft for various reasons. We'll explore that further on. I would like to do a quick word about witchcraft, in fact. Despite it being a popular film and literature trope, it was not a common occurrence for midwives to be accused of witchcraft, particularly at the beginning of the Middle Ages. There are few records of them being punished as such. Despite that, there are a lot of movies, The Devil's Whore, Game of Thrones, Crucible, Salem, where these women are portrayed as untrustworthy witches, which has led to some stereotypes regarding these professions. In reality, these women were well respected and very valued within their community. They did, however, have a decline of influence that was relevant to this towards the end of the medieval period. There was more church oversight. They were required to get licenses, which many men were not required to do. And honestly, their history, they wrote them out. A lot of men took credit for women's midwife work, and their history was not passed down the same way that it should have been. There are some notable midwives of the medieval times I'd like to talk to you about. There is Jochebed Felicia. She was a 14th century physician and midwife. In 1322, Jochebed was put on trial for practicing medicine without a license, which was a privilege that was only reserved for men primarily at that time. Her patients testified in her favor, praising her skills and stating that she had better results than the male doctors and they didn't want to see the male doctors. Despite that, Jochebed was ultimately banned from practicing medicine because she was a woman. Her story reflects that the growing regulation of medical practices by the state, which often excluded women and confined them to specific roles like midwifery, was very much affecting them. Jochebed's case shows how skilled female healers were sidelined by male-dominant professionals, regardless if they were competent or not. I don't like this picture. It was the only one I could really find depicting her. I'm sorry. Our second midwife that I would like to bring into light would be Agnes Sampson. She's a little bit more on the end of what would be considered the medieval times, but I think it's a very important story. A little bit of a trigger warning for a little bit of torture talk. She was a Scottish midwife who died in 1591 after being put on trial for witchcraft. She gained tragic notoriety during the North Renwick witch trials of 1591, which was a series of Scottish witch hunts in which over 70 people were accused of witchcraft and plotting to kill the king. Sampson, known for her healing abilities, was accused of witchcraft, allegedly conspiring to harm King James VI by conjuring storms that would sink his ship. During the witch trial, midwives and healers were often targeted. Now, Agnes, before she was executed, was put through some torture, which did lead to her confessing to witchcraft. This was very common. Unfortunately, that's why torture is against the Geneva Convention. Torture that she had to endure included shaving her entire body looking for a devil's mark, which is just honestly a freckle, a scar, a blemish. Very hard to get your whole life without one of those. She was put in a strappito, which essentially is her arms were put behind her back. She was lifted very high and then dropped rapidly, which would dislocate her shoulders and was incredibly painful. She would also have a witch bridle put around her face, which essentially is a large iron or metal contraption that goes into your mouth, preventing you from talking because no one wanted the witches to put a spell on them or curse them. Her story is a tragic, stark reminder that although midwives were dealing with birth and death, they could also be scapegoated during this time when fear and superstition would take over. I think this is very relevant to what people don't understand they can be afraid of. The witch trials illustrated how society's fear of the unknown led to the persecution of women like Samson, who were misunderstood and unjustly punished. Then we learned a little bit about this in class as well, but one of the most famous midwives of medieval times would be Trotula of Salerno. So this one is very interesting. As we learned in week 4, she was an 11th century Italian physician and midwife. She was often regarded as the first gynecologist in Western history, though there is some debate with scholars whether or not her true identity is what they think or if she even truly existed. The work that she contributed to, she was associated with famous medical schools, the famous medical school in Salerno, where she specialized in women's health. She authored the Trotula, which is a series of medical texts, as we learned, that covers the range of women's health, including fertility, menstrual disorders, and postpartum care. Very relevant or revolutionary for this time. Her work is highly respected and became reference for medical practitioners, both male and female, throughout the Middle Ages. Her significance is that her texts were revolutionary for their time, and they treated women's health as legitimate and important in an area where it wasn't thought of to be that way before. Her contributions laid the groundwork for future gynecologists and significantly advanced knowledge of women's healthcare. How do we know all this? How do we know what we know about midwives? Well, mostly we know this because of letters and personal writings. Despite efforts to have these women written out of history, we have records detailing important work through these women. These records are important glimpses into the personal lives of medieval people in all classes. So we get a lot of our information, just as earlier I mentioned, through letters from one person to another that have survived. We also do know a lot about what we know because of the legal oversight that they were forced to endure. Over time, they were subjected to more oversight, more licensing, there was more oaths, and because of this, we have more documentation about their work and what they did and who they were. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword there. And also, unfortunately, some of the most detailed information comes from trials, such as the accusation of practicing without a license, or in more extreme cases, the witchcraft trials. These records were often used to strip midwives of their autonomy, positioning them as a threat to male-dominated medical fields or as a scapegoat during times of crisis, which left us lots of information, but is very sad that it happened at all. Now, the legacy of medieval midwives of the modern times, so you would say. So, despite the challenges that they faced, midwives left an enduring legacy that can still be seen in modern times. Today, midwives continue to assist in births both in hospital and in home. Their knowledge of childbirth has shaped how we think about women's healthcare. This profession of midwifery is experiencing resurgence in popularity, in fact. In 2021, 12% of births in the U.S. were attended by midwives, and the trend is continuing to grow, with many more opting for midwife-assisted home births, in contrast to hospital deliveries compared to how it once was. They still exist expectant mothers in modern times, and they're becoming much more common. As I said, in 2021, 12% of the births were attended by a midwife, and over 1% of births in the U.S. are intentionally at home. In conclusion, midwives have left an important mark on healthcare, specifically in women's healthcare. They have left records detailing midwives' work that have given us a deeply intimate glimpse into the lives of midwives and medieval folk of all social classes through this. And the modern views of a midwife are very different than what the stereotype might be. Their legacy continues in modern healthcare, and despite the dangers they faced, midwives were saviors in a time when childbirth was fraught with risk, and their contributions have shaped the way we approach maternity health today. Thank you for joining me in exploring the world of medieval midwives. If you have any questions or want to learn more about this fascinating history, let me know. Feel free to reach out, and thank you. These are my sources. Thank you very much.